I'm sitting in a wheelchair on my son's driveway as the gate slams behind him. The cold bites through my cardigan, and his face is like stone. I tell him I have nowhere else to go, and he shuts the door on me. I whisper that I have nothing left, and then, quiet as a secret, I say that by morning, one found card will change everything. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge, like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. Picture the driveway, the slammed door, my trembling hands curled around a crumpled photograph and an old business card tucked in a drawer. Stay with me. I'll take you from that freezing moment to the discovery of Arthur's hidden life, the trap he built, and how helplessness turned into a plan that upended everything they thought they owned. I remember the exact sound the floor made when I fell, an ugly, hollow crack that swallowed itself under the hospital's fluorescent hum. For a moment, everything was reduced to two noises: my breath ricocheting in my chest and the steady, indifferent tick of a clock that belonged to somebody else's life. The antiseptic smell hit me first, sharp and metallic like pennies and old pennies, followed by the softer, dull odor of disinfectant and lemon wax that tried too hard to erase pain. Nurses came and went in a blur of practiced sympathy. Their shoes whispered across linoleum, the bed rails groaned as they moved me, and at night the machines sang small clinical lullabies that never let me forget I was broken. I could still feel the impact, how my hip had taken the weight and then refused to take anything at all. The sound of bone against bone had been an animal sound, not loud but final in the way a snapped branch is. For the first nights, I floated in a fog of pain and morphine, interrupted by the thin alien light of visiting hours and the distant murmur of other people's grief. I learned the rhythm of helplessness, the way the hospital pillow folded under my head, the way the sheets smelled like starch and other people's laundry, the way my hands would search for something to hold and find only the air. When I came home, home had shrunk. The house that Arthur and I had built with decades of small, steady gestures felt too big and wildly empty, like a stage after the audience had left. The rooms echoed with memories: his cup left on the saucer, the faint dust pattern where a photo had sat, the ledger he kept in a battered tin that smelled of paper and peppermint. I moved through the rooms, learning their new geography in a wheelchair, how the doorway felt narrower, how the threshold caught the chair's rim, how my fingers learned the map of each knob and corner. The winter crept in around the hems of my cardigan, and the cold sat in my bones like an unwanted thought. Bills started to pile in a way that made me dizzy. Envelopes slid from the mailbox like small, pointless promises. I would sit at the kitchen table and spread them out: water, electricity, a reminder from the doctor, and listen to the quiet clink when I tried shaking loose a coin from my pocket. The pockets were hollow. I tapped them like they were lies and felt only lint. I found myself emptying drawers for change, watching the coins jump across the wooden floor and roll under the radiator. The sound of the tin hitting hardwood was a private kind of grief. David used to call on Sundays. The calls had thinned into text messages, then into the occasional curt voicemail. When he came by after the fall, his smile was quick and practiced, the kind that never reached his eyes. He had the same clipped tone he used at the office when a problem needed to be dismissed rather than solved. Jennifer walked in behind him like she belonged to a different weather system, perfume announcing her as she passed, the curious, immaculate scent of something expensive and impossible to scrub away. Her nails were always perfect, the little crescents of beige and lacquer, and she had a way of checking her phone mid-conversation, as if any minute there might be something more interesting elsewhere. "You can't move in here, Mum," he said, and the words landed with a certainty that felt surgical. They were not loud, they didn't need to be. They fit into the space between two polite gestures and took the rest of the room with them. Jennifer folded her arms, one hand still holding her phone, her face a study in sympathy practiced into a weapon. "We just bought new furniture," she added, the phrase like a curtain being pulled over the top of me. I remember the way the light caught the beads of condensation on the water glass she offered, and how she put a magazine on the coffee table as if to mend the moment with gloss and distraction. There were nights after that where the shame sat heavy and warm in my lap, more unbearable than the physical pain. I thought about the way Arthur had used to make tea, how he'd boil the kettle until the whole kitchen smelled of bergamot and biscuits, how he would stir the tea the same way every time, never missing a beat. Those small, ordinary gestures became talismans of a life I feared I'd lost forever. I pictured my grandchildren's faces, little mouths that had once opened at the sound of my name, and the helplessness at not being able to lift them, to twine my fingers with theirs at the park. I missed the ordinary tasks, the demands and the laughter, the mundane proofs that I mattered to someone. I told myself things in short, hard lines to keep from dissolving into panic. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for family. The words steadied me the way splints steady a broken bone. They were the first thing I spoke aloud when the night pressed too close. They were not a plea for pity, but a demand for what was owed in the simplest sense: care, presence, recognition. The house offered no solutions. The wheelchair squeaked over the threshold when I went to the driveway to wait, and the stones bit at the tires, each small jolt a reminder of how exposed the body is when it can't hide behind independence. I learned every sound that my body could make that others would hear: the rasp of breath climbing a curb, the small curse when the chair caught on a crack, the way my hands tightened on the armrests until knuckles went white. Strangers passed, neighbors with their dogs, delivery men with boxes, the low hum of life that continued regardless. Money, or the lack of it, made its own cruel comments. Notices arrived, folded and unsentimental, a faint suggestion that time was running out, printed in impersonal fonts. I would watch the calendar and count off days like beads and imagine the numbers shrinking towards something final. The quiet clinking of unopened envelopes against the wooden table became a metronome for my anxiety. There were small humiliations: the pharmacy reminding me of past due balances, the cable company sending a bill with the same polite demand as a summons. It felt like the world had designed a system that could punish without understanding the person at its mercy. On one late afternoon, wrapped in a cardigan that smelled faintly of Arthur's aftershave, I rolled myself to the mailbox because the thought of watching bills pile up undelivered felt like failing at housekeeping. My fingers curled around the edges of an envelope. The flap resisted for a second, like something else resisting the truth. Inside, a statement from the bank made numbers dance and land in a way that meant something less than stability. I sat back, the wheelchair's wheels whispering on the gravel, and let the cold creep in through my layers. The winter wind made the hedges look like mourners, nodding without moving. David's house was the final place I thought to go because it was the last visible proof of family I could see from my road. I imagined them as an island of domestic ease, the place where my grandchildren's laughter was loud and soft at once. I pictured the curtains opening and the two of them coming to the door and asking me to come inside, to be part of the hearth again. In truth, my hope was naive and tender. They had built a life with careful partitions, and my need did not fit into any of their rooms. When I turned up at the driveway that afternoon, the air was brittle and clear. David opened the door with that same quick, rehearsed smile, and his eyes moved over me as if cataloging a problem rather than greeting a person. Jennifer stood behind him like a painted figure, her perfume bright. There was no softening, no hesitation, just the clinical assessment of an inconvenience. "You can't move in here, Mum," he said, and the sentence hinged and shut. I held my breath and tried to arrange my face into patience, into something that would tell them I wasn't imploding with every syllable. I thought of Arthur's hands, calloused from years of small accounting work, steady when he worried and unshowy when he loved. I thought about the tin where he kept his receipts and the little note he always left folded in his shirt pocket, ordinary things that suddenly looked like clues in a life I hadn't fully read. They closed the gate. The sound of metal against metal translated then to the finality of that moment. I felt small and exposed, my wheelchair suddenly inadequate armor against a world that had decided I was surplus. I waited on the path like a figure in a painting, still hollowed out, needing to be seen, the cold pressed under my cardigan, and found the damp places that sorrow leaves, the stones dug at the wheels, and I could feel the world move on both sides of the gate. A porch light clicked across the way and cut a small circle of yellow. into the dusk. A neighbor had come out to see who was there. From that small illumination someone watched, an anonymous figure framed in domestic glow, a stranger's silhouette that felt like an audience at a trial. I sat there watching the light and listening to the distant, private noises of other people's safety. The driveway behind me was quiet, the door closed like a verdict, and in the dim, I felt the first real cold of being alone. The attic smelled like old paper in winter. Dust thick in the air, sun through a small square of glass, catching the floating motes like confetti. I had thought clearing Arthur's things would be simple. A few boxes, a handful of memories, the polite closing of a life we had lived together. Instead, I found little countries of his life folded into drawers and tins, neat economies of habit that hinted at a man who kept more than receipts. Receipts, yes, dozens, stacked by date and glued with his careful handwriting, but also letters, a taped photograph of us on a holiday that had faded at the edges, and a thin cardboard box tied with twine. When I untied the box, the knot opened like the lid of something secret. The box was small and ordinary, the kind of thing you might hide matches in. Inside were envelopes of varying sizes, a ledger whose pages whispered when I turned them, and a business card that lay like a stone at the bottom. The card's paper was heavier than ordinary stock, the edges slightly toothy where it had rubbed against other things. I picked it up and felt the weight of it as if it were a promise. The script was tiny and precise, the letters leaning with such quiet confidence I could almost hear them speak. Jonathan Maxwell, Pinnacle Private Banking. The name sat in a corner, black ink pressed neat, and beneath it a number and an address in the kind of print Arthur would have admired, clean, functional, private. That card shifted the room. I had always known Arthur as the kind of man who clipped coupons with the kind of reverence some people reserve for letters from children. He measured water in teacups and kept his socks folded in the same direction for reasons he never explained. His ledger had always been a quaint, modest object on the kitchen table. Columns of numbers penciled in a scrupulous hand, small sums rounded into habits that looked like thrift. He was, by all outward appearances, the kind of ordinary man whose quietness was its own modest virtue. But the card suggested meetings I had not attended, conversations in places with names that sounded like banks and mansions and discreet lunches. It suggested an economy of shadow where Arthur had moved in a different currency than the one I understood. I held the card and felt both foolish and suddenly reverent, like someone who discovers that the neighbor they'd always waved at from the garden kept an entire greenhouse behind the fence. How well do we know the people we live beside, I wondered, if a single card could rearrange a life's geography? I brought the things to the kitchen table as if to lay them out for an inquest. The paper had a smell of old glue and peppermints. The ledger's spine creaked when I opened it. There were entries that read like tiny acts of devotion, an account for school books, a small deposit for birthdays, next to others that made no immediate sense but suggested a scale I had not imagined. Late-night deposits from unfamiliar brokerage firms, terse telegraphic notes, initials that repeated like a signature hidden in plain sight. The juxtaposition of Arthur's coupons and these entries felt like two different men breathing under the same roof. I called Victoria Hayes because calling an attorney felt like the right first act in a play where I had been an unwitting extra. Her office had the hush of a room that expected bad news. The receptionist knew how to fold sympathy into a professional pause. When Victoria answered, her voice was a precise instrument. "Mrs. Bennet," she said, and in that single syllable I heard the city's quiet business, appointments, files, deadlines. I told her about the card, and there was a small intake of breath that sounded almost personal. "Bring everything you have," she said, "and come in tomorrow. Don't try to sort more tonight." Her tone was clipped, professional. The words were a coat I could wrap around myself, heavy with authority. That night, I lay awake thinking of Arthur's small habits and the way his fingers stained with ink when he wrote. I thought of the times he had left the radio on low in the kitchen just to keep me company, the way he would stand by the window and watch storms move across the fields. There were things I had dismissed as thrift, and now wondered whether they were parts of a plan I had not been asked to read. The next morning, the city seemed to hold its breath. Victoria's office was a narrow room with a window that looked over a line of plane trees and the dull green roofs of other lives. The waiting area smelled faintly of lemon polish and new carpet. When she ushered me into her office, she closed the door with a decisiveness that made the room quieter. Papers were already on her desk, and she moved through them with a kind of efficient patience I found comforting. Her eyes skimmed the card, then looked back at me. "You found him," she said, and it was not a question so much as a verification. Then she sat back, fingers joined. "Arthur Maxwell?" Mr. Bennett had a fairly complex set of holdings. We handled some of them on behalf of clients who preferred discretion. Her voice was measured, but there was something in the way she paused that told me more than her words did. I watched her face for any sign of the drama I felt and struggled to hold the disbelief that rose in my throat. "How is this possible?" The question was small and stupid in the face of paperwork that suddenly explained more years than any one conversation could. She slid a file toward me, and there, in legal type and tempered ink, were names and entities and a phrase that made the room tilt: fiduciary instructions, trusts, and a private banking account established in contingency. Victoria's hands were steady as she pointed out the clause that mattered: a directive to be executed under specified emergencies, including financial hardship, serious illness, or abandonment by immediate family. "He left instructions," she said, and the words landed like a bell inside me. There was a stunned pause, a soft retraction of breath she did not try to hide. "He planned for certain contingencies many years ago. We have a directive to follow when and if those conditions are met." Her voice was all business again, but the pause had been human. I felt something inside me shatter and rearrange itself at once, like glass making a new pattern as it falls. I remember sitting very still while Victoria explained how private banking could operate: accounts held as a matter of discretion, trustees appointed in confidence, mechanisms that only triggered under strict, pre-agreed conditions. The legal language was both alien and suddenly intimate. Words meant to protect, to enact a plan after a person's death, to take care of realities the living could hardly bear to imagine. "Contingency," she said again, as if the repetition might make the concept more tangible. Part of me recoiled with a petty, indignant sadness. Why keep this from me? How many nights had Arthur worked on spreadsheets instead of sharing his worries? Had he thought me incapable of understanding? Had he thought me better sheltered by ignorance? Yet, layered over that sharpness was an easing, a warmth like the first weak sun after frost. He planned for my worst because he believed I might be abandoned, I thought in a sentence that felt like a key turning. Images unfurled, Arthur's quiet meetings at odd hours, his polite lunches with men whose faces I did not know, the small folded notes he left in his jacket pockets that I assumed were trivial. I had been blind not out of malice, but out of the ordinary rhythm of marriage, the trusting of the other to hold what they needed to hold. Now those small domestic artifacts revealed themselves as the architecture of protection. The sentence repeated in my head with a softness that cut. He had thought of my solitude and made arrangements as if he could forecast the cruelty of the future. Victoria's phone hummed, a small interruption of the morning, and she glanced at the display with a practiced indifference, then returned to me. "We'll need an investigator to confirm the state of affairs," she said, "and confidentiality is crucial. If certain parties smell movement, they may take steps that complicate administration." Her meaning was clear. Secrecy had to be maintained until the legal levers were safely pulled. The next days became a patchwork of quiet phone calls and small, careful meetings. There was an investigator whose voice was like gravel, but whose questions were delicate, a ledger being read through with the careful curiosity of someone unraveling a skein. The investigation felt like watching a slow, clinical uncovering, transactions traced, names matched, late-night withdrawals linked to a habit that had, until recently, hidden in plain sight. There was a list of numbers and dates that formed a pattern so ugly it made my stomach hollow out. Debts, credit calls, signs of desperation, traced in the neat ink of bank statements. I learned things about David I had never known: the rhythm of his spending, the furtive calls in the night, the way his mortgage payments had finally begun to lag. Each fact was like a minor shock, A small electrical jolt of recognition and then sorrow. I could see him in his shirt at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched over a laptop, the light from the screen carving an anxious face. I pictured the quick lines of his hands as he tapped a phone, the small betrayals that show themselves not in grand acts, but in the quiet choices that add up. Betrayal burned, not as thunder, but as a steady heat. How many small acts of omission had built into this? How had Arthur read the future so clearly that he felt compelled to build a safety net in solitude? I felt like a child who had just learned that a parent had been a hero in secret, simultaneously proud and excluded. Relief came not as triumph, but as a tide, slow and silver, moving through the cove of my grief. It was a comfort that had teeth, protection wrapped in loneliness. Victoria's office became the center of a small conspiracy of care. There were afternoons when I would sit and watch her type notes with a kind of tender efficiency, files fanned across her desk like cards in a careful hand. She would look up and explain the implications, trusts to be activated, trustees to be notified, legal mechanisms that would remain dormant until certain events occurred. The architecture Arthur had built was precise, the kind of thought that takes years and a certain sober intelligence to assemble. It was not impulse, it was intention dressed as paperwork. Finally, on a gray morning that felt like the breath between states, Victoria slid a sealed envelope across her desk. The paper had been waxed and folded with the sort of care that suggested the end of a book. I stared at it as if it might begin to speak. My fingers hovered because, in some secret place, opening that envelope would be like reading the last chapter of a life I had shared. She watched me with a look that contained both the steady calm of a professional and the small human acknowledgement of someone who sees the weight of what another must carry. She did not rush me. She merely said, almost in a whisper that was out of habit rather than law, "This contains Arthur's final instructions." The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper the way a church smells of old prayers. Victoria sat behind her desk with a folder open between us, the sunlight slicing the room into neat, honest halves. She folded her fingers and looked at me as if weighing an answer. "When we talk about contingencies," she said, voice even and careful, "we use precise language. True emergency is not a poetic phrase here. It means financial hardship that threatens basic care, serious medical crisis, or family abandonment." She tapped the page where the clause lived, the words black on white, family abandonment. The phrase looked small and monstrous at once, a legal definition reduced to a line that could change everything. Hearing it read aloud made the concept human. It stopped being a paragraph in a file and became a judgment, one that could be proved with signatures, dates, and the steady arithmetic of neglect. Victoria explained that the clause had to be met with evidence, documented refusal of care, refusal to provide shelter or financial support, or active legal steps to control the ward's affairs without regard for well-being. Her voice did the work of transforming dry terms into the lived possibilities of cruelty. She described the mechanics: trustees appointed to oversee the account, instructions tucked into the bank's private safe, and triggers written so cleanly only the right sequence could set them loose. "It isn't instantaneous," she said. "There are checks, confirmations, signatures. But it is automatic once criteria are met. That's the point. This is protection structured to act without emotion, because emotion can be manipulated." As she spoke, my mind drifted to images of Arthur hunched over a lamp late at night. The study in our house had always been his small kingdom, a green-shaded banker's lamp that threw a pool of light over a worn desk, a cheap clock that ticked like a metronome, and a faint residue of tobacco. I could see him there now, bent, methodical, the tang of cigarette ash in the air like a punctuation mark after a hard sentence. Those evenings had felt mundane then. The shuffling of papers, the low murmur of the wireless, his hand occasionally tapping a figure into place. Now they read like archival footage of a man building a fortress in secret. Victoria's description opened the ledger's pages in my mind as if through a projector. I saw stock tickers on a tiny screen, the glow of numbers riffling across the dark. I saw Arthur's silhouette at a cafe window, a waiter refilling his tea while he signed something quickly and folded it away. I saw a list of accounts with names I didn't recognize and addresses that sounded like private rooms in big buildings where nothing much is spoken aloud. The montage of small domestic details, his clipped coupons, the way he liked his receipts stapled, already seemed to belong to a different life, stitched into ours. Then came the investigator's report, flat and clinical at first, until the facts became a map of ruin. It read like a travelogue through someone else's secret desperation. David's gambling trail appeared in transactions, late-night withdrawals, transfers to entities with blank names, payments at racetracks and online platforms flagged in the margins. Victoria read the details slowly, each line falling like a stone into a jar that was already full. October 12th, 11:42 p.m., withdrawal $5,000, she said, letting the numbers land. October 13th, 1:07 a.m., online wager $4,750. November 2nd, payment to Blue Ridge Gaming $12,500. Each entry slowed, the cadence deliberate, and with each readout, a private life that I thought I knew was shown in transactions instead of gestures. The ledger of David's life, once mostly holiday photos and soccer schedules, now had columns that spoke in a language of loss. The report didn't just list gambles, it traced the consequences, missed mortgage payments, late notices, calls from collection agencies. There were entries that made my chest hollow, overdrafts covered with short-term loans, lines of credit maxed, the steady accretion of interest like barnacles eating away at a hull. The numbers sat there on the page, patient and implacable. No accusation was needed. The arithmetic accused him with a cold logic that left no room for excuses. As Victoria spoke, comprehension moved through me like a slow tide. I pictured David at his kitchen table late at night, the blue glow of his laptop painting his face, his fingers moving too fast. I saw him slipping a card out of his wallet in a hurried hand, the relief at a stripe working, the small, fierce hope when a number appeared green on a screen. That hope could have been anything once, an investment, a business venture, until the ledger turned it into a pattern of escape. The tenderness I had felt for my son shifted into clarity and then into a kind of grief that was both mine and not mine. Then Victoria laid out the cunning of Arthur's design. It was not merely the existence of money, it was the architecture that used legal form to neutralize the particular vulnerabilities of family dynamics. He had not only set up trust accounts, he had anticipated the very moment when a child might see an ailing parent as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected. He foresaw litigation, petitions for guardianship, the cold calculus of people who measure love in ledgers. The mechanism he used, Victoria said, voice steady but small, was to have certain co-signatories and influence over loans that affect family members. There are clauses that can accelerate debt under specific legal actions. If an immediate family member seeks to limit a beneficiary's control without demonstrating genuine need, certain lenders can call in loans that have been co-signed or otherwise guaranteed. The way she explained it made the technical sound almost surgical in its cruelty and paradoxically in its foresight. She showed me a diagram, a neat flowchart in black and gray, where a petition to be declared incompetent fed a trigger that moved through the legal system into the financial one. The trigger would not whisper. It would roar. Loans Arthur had quietly influenced would be accelerated. Lines of credit would be called, and liens could be enforced. The result was swift financial destabilization for whoever had been living off credit or risky income. It didn't punish with fists or fire, but with the collapse of the scaffolding someone else had built around a life. The first time I read those clauses, I felt a peculiar mix of anger and awe. The thought of building such a trap felt almost surgical, methodical, patient, antiseptic. It was cruelty and care braided together, cruel if it fell on the wrong person, caring if it saved the intended. I thought of Arthur night after night, composing instructions like a composer writing the end of a symphony for a future he could no longer conduct. The investigator's notes supplied the missing particulars. Co-signed, Bennett and Davidson Mortgage, July 2016, one line read, loan influenced via third-party guarantee, August 2018. The report, mapped the relationships. Several of David's major purchases had in some way been underwritten by the man my husband had been in ways I had not known. Arthur's quiet authority in financial matters had given him leverage he could deploy, should the instruments be triggered correctly. Hearing this, the small theater of my life shifted. It was as if everything Arthur had ever done in the kitchen, folding napkins to the letter, repairing the radio without fuss, was now recast as a long game with stakes I had not imagined. The revelation was two-edged. It exposed Arthur as both protector and strategist, and it made me feel like a person who had been both loved and kept safe by someone who understood the world's cruelties too well. A terrible clarity formed in me then. The trap was not meant to hurt a child out of vengeance. It was meant to protect me by making it too costly for a child to abuse their position. The mechanism would not single out innocence. It would turn predatory behavior back upon itself by using financial consequences as the instrument of justice. It was, as I thought then and still think, cruel and brilliant. The word cruel lodged because the tool Arthur had designed required someone to move against me for it to spring. It required betrayal to justify its own existence. The thought of that made my stomach twist. I could feel the bitterness of being used, even as I recognized the perfection of a plan that anticipated human weakness. Every legal page I read that day tightened the knot of inevitability. Victoria spelled out what would happen procedurally. If a petition was filed, notices would be sent, trustees would consult, and lenders, if the trigger conditions were met, could seek immediate repayment, property could be foreclosed upon, and co-signees might find themselves suddenly on the hook. It was a form of justice designed to be impersonal and absolute. When the investigator's voice came through, with the last piece of the mosaic, it arrived like a small avalanche. He had been watching patterns and had noticed behavior that matched what Arthur might have feared. There's significant activity in Mr. Davidson's account, he told us. Transfers to gaming platforms, repeated withdrawals late at night, a recent extension on a second mortgage. These are signs of financial distress. He listed amounts and dates with a dryness that made my head swim. Victoria read them aloud again, slowly for emphasis. April 5th, $20,000 transfer. April 18th, loan extension $15,000. May 2nd, missed mortgage payment. The cadence made the arithmetic accumulate as if by repetition the facts would be carved more deeply into the record of what had been done. Each number had a sound, the hollow echo of something lost. Then the final note landed with the weight of inevitability. The investigator had uncovered communications suggesting David had begun to take steps that would indicate readiness to file for competency. Emails with an attorney's office, a brief recorded meeting, all the quiet precursors of legal motion. My breath caught as if someone had flicked a switch. The trap Arthur had set could be armed by the very person who had spoken the words that left me on a driveway. There are moments when the timeline of your life leaps ahead like a skipped record and you see the shape of consequences laid out in stark relief. I felt the outline of what might come. Petitions filed, trustees convened, lenders reacting, and a child's comfortable life beginning to tremble under the weight of debts that would be called home. The knowledge did not soothe so much as sharpen. It made me awake to the structural intelligence Arthur had left me, and to the moral reality that his plan required the cruelty of another to complete itself. "You knew this could happen?" I asked, voice small. Victoria's hand rested on the files, a steadying presence. Mr. Bennett anticipated several possibilities. He knew people could act out of desperation. That's why his instructions are so specific. Her reply was not consoling. It was a fact delivered with professional calm. The office seemed suddenly too small for all the futures it had just revealed. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of contracts and clauses and the quiet architecture of retribution. Inside, the papers lay between us like a map to a new world. I thought of Arthur in his lamplit study, cigarette ash drifting like a slow-falling snow. I thought of David at his kitchen table, the glow of a laptop painting worries into his face. I thought of betrayal as a kind of arithmetic. I felt something reconfigure in me then. Not revenge exactly, but the cold, steady understanding that the world could be set so that those who would use me would find themselves constrained by their own choices. It was a complex comfort, not sweet, but solid. The final sting was practical and immediate. Victoria informed me, with the professionalism of someone who had seen these scenes before, that David had already consulted an attorney and looked into filing a competency petition. The words landed and the room tilted in a way that made my hands go suddenly numb. The kettle hissed in the small hours like an alarm that only I could hear, steam fogging the kitchen window while outside the world slept. Paper shuffled under my fingertips as if the house itself were rearranging its secrets. The rustle was a private language, and I learned it quickly. Late-night calls to the investigator became a ritual. His voice low, practical, delivering facts with the bluntness of someone who had seen too many lives unspool. I laid the legal papers across the table and felt each edge, the weight of signatures and seals like small, deliberate stones. The feel of the paper was oddly intimate, a texture that spoke of pens, of human hands that had made decisions to be acted on long after the loneliness of the maker. Victoria and I spoke in a cadence that was equal parts urgency and quiet. We moved through contingencies and clauses the way two experienced travelers might map a route through unfamiliar terrain. "We act the moment he moves," she said once, the sentence a thin blade of certainty. Her tone left nothing to debate. I repeated it in my head like a talisman because there was a peculiar comfort in having someone else name what needed doing. The coded letter Arthur had left for Jonathan Maxwell was tucked into an inner file. The paper was folded to a particular crease only he had used, an intimacy that felt like a secret handshake. Victoria ran her finger along the fold and nodded. "This is the signal. It tells them how to proceed discreetly." The practicalities were surgical. We froze accounts that had to remain private. We verified the identities of trustees who would act without fanfare. We checked the lockboxes and confirmed passwords that I had only ever half understood when Arthur handled the bank calls. There was a small, absurd satisfaction in mastering the technical language of protection. IBANs and beneficiary codes became suddenly meaningful. The activation protocols had to be infallible. The lawyer's voice on a conference call sounded like a metronome as she recited procedures and backups. I learned the names of institutions I had never needed to know, and the faces of professionals who seemed to exist in a parallel economy of discretion. There were nights I stayed awake, listening to the hiss of the kettle and the rustle of papers, imagining the moment the mechanism would click. I tried to imagine then what the sound would be: an email, a phone call, a quiet footfall in a room where money moved like a sleeper wave. That imagined sound became a compass for my fear and a point around which I could focus my plans. So the planning was equal parts mechanical and moral. We had to be precise so Arthur's hard foresight would work exactly as he intended. But we also had to hold fast to something that felt like decency in the way it would be applied. Obstacles arrived with the polite brutality of people who thought themselves justified. David's lawyer sent a letter that arrived at dawn like bad weather, crisp and formal, and designed to string a different story into public record. He spoke of hearings and the need to protect my interests, using the language of care as if it were a shield. Jennifer, with her practiced patience, tried to rewrite what had happened the day I sat on their driveway. In a mediation room that smelled of old coffee and lemon polish, she looked across the table and suggested, in that clinical, thin way people use when they hope a suggestion will pass for an argument, that I had been a danger to myself. "She's unsteady," Jennifer told the social worker with a voice like a measured temperature, "and it's simply safer for everyone if we consider assisted living." The social worker sipped sour coffee and nodded, eyes lowered as if to look at paperwork rather than people. Their words stung because they arrived coated in a veneer of care that tried to convince others, and perhaps themselves, that they were acting morally. The underpinning of their argument was a comfort I had once afforded them, calling a person's autonomy into question because it was inconvenient to assume the work of care. When they framed the conversation around safety, they were also choosing to ignore memory, history, and the small human contracts that are not written, but lived. I felt the old ache of being cataloged into a category I hadn't chosen: burden, problem, liability, and the indignity of being measured by mortgage interest rather than by the ways I had loved. Victoria's voice through it all was steady and bracing. She reminded me again and again why secrecy mattered. If you let this be loud, they'll act, they'll panic. We keep it contained until the mechanism can do its work. She had a way of saying things that made clutter clear, not melodrama, but a plan. We set our timetables in a ledger of our own, small checkboxes of action that made me feel like I had something to hold in my hands aside from grief. Activating trustees was an act of trust in itself, a selection of people who promised to act without spectacle and with cold competence. The coded letter to Jonathan Maxwell was the key that set all the quiet machinery in motion. I felt a strange kinship to Arthur when I remembered the exact way he had folded that note and slipped it away. The first skirmishes of legal maneuvering sounded distant at first: letters, calls, the measured tone of firm-to-firm conversation. But then the world shifted. David's lawyer began to press for hearings, formal steps meant to speed a narrative he hoped would make me appear less able than I was. He used clinical language that tried to make my life into a legal problem, rather than a relationship. Each motion read to me like an attempt to sever something invisible and essential: the obligation of a child to a parent, by paper and precedent. Jennifer, meanwhile, upped her efforts outside the room. She questioned me in front of strangers with a smile so practiced it became a mask, and in those moments I felt movement in the air like a current. The slow, corrosive work of gaslighting that persuades witnesses more than the person it's aimed at. There were ugly, quiet scenes, an assessment meeting where a social worker's clipboard became another instrument in the orchestra of regulation, the sour coffee in a paper cup warming in our hands as we all pretended that the problem could be solved with more paperwork. I remember the taste, bitter and flat, and how its tang pressed against the bright panic that rose in my throat when a new document arrived. In that room, words like competency and best interests orbited the table and folded into themselves like quick hands covering a bruise. Then the execution began in the small electric hum of modern life. The petition was filed on a Tuesday morning, an act that felt both absurdly bureaucratic and profoundly intimate. Papers entered a system that never sleeps, a clerk stamped forms without looking up, and a file number was issued that tied a moment into procedural motion. I received the notice like a physical shove, an email that appeared in my inbox with the kind of cold formality that made my chest hollow. The whoosh of alerts began as a small noise and then multiplied. A cascade of messages and notifications that felt like pebbles thrown into a pond, widening into a panic. Arthur's mechanism, however, moved with a deliberate slowness that felt like the reverse of panic. Where my son's world had assumed speed was salvation, Arthur had built time into his protections, checks and balances that required verification but were ultimately decisive. The cold calculus of cosigners and influenced loans flipped. Lenders who had previously allowed arrears and extensions found the legal trigger they needed to act. Notices landed in mailboxes and inboxes with formal language, demand letters, calls for immediate repayment, alerts that account terms had changed. The house's equity, the quiet scaffolding that had supported a dozen small pleasures, began to retreat like tidewater. I watched these notices arrive and felt the architecture of our lives shift like furniture being rearranged while we were asleep. In David and Jennifer's home, the first sounds were small and human: footsteps, the rustle of a shirt, the slam of a cupboard as someone looked for a paper or a bill. Then came the frantic sounds: the scuff of shoes on polished floors, the snap of a phone being picked up, the breathless exchange of whispered curses in a kitchen that had been built on plans of stability. Emails whooshed. A bank notification pinged, a single letter thudded against their doormat and seemed to make the floor less steady beneath their feet. Jennifer's perfume seemed too bright against the sudden pall of alarm. I listened at a distance, and felt a new kind of equilibrium set into motion. One that made money itself an active player in the unfolding drama. There was a perverse kind of orchestration to the notes that arrived. Trustees consulting, lawyers ticking boxes, lenders issuing demands. The legal mechanism Arthur had designed did not create spectacle, it created consequence. Where they had once treated finances as a backdrop to a life, the ledger began to insist on being foreground. I watched the cascade unfold through daily updates from Victoria and the investigator, each entry another small clinical victory in the plan Arthur had left like a map. Their attempts to counter were as panicked as they were predictable. David's lawyer threatened hearings and contested filings, trying to spin the petition into a story that would justify quick control. Jennifer called contacts and made calls that felt like flares into the fog. Efforts to find short-term cash, to renegotiate, to stall. They tried to find a loophole, a sympathetic banker, a missing form, but Arthur's architecture had thought of obfuscation and contingency. The freeze orders and trustee activations were designed to withstand the first wave of this kind of scrambling. The house's equity evaporated in a manner that was at once administrative and brutal. Notices of acceleration came with the measured language of institutions and the brutal immediacy of financial reality. Sums due immediately. Foreclosure procedures outlined as steps. Account balances rendered into stark numbers. The cascade was a series of doors closing, mortgage grace periods revoked, lines of credit pulled back, refinancing offers withdrawn. The world they had decorated so carefully began to look like a fragile stage set dissolving under rain. Inside their home, the human sound became ragged. I heard the pacing, feet on hardwood becoming a staccato of panic. There were muffled arguments at the sink, the slapping of a towel, the desperate search for paperwork that might change a number. I imagined David reading message after message and feeling the slow, catastrophic realization of a man watching his scaffold collapse. It was not loud. It was a small, private unraveling that had the force of a storm. Sudden gusts of fear, the lashing of consequences, then a long, stunned silence. On a night I had learned to measure by the faint glow of my phone screen, Victoria sent me an update with the exactitude of someone reporting weather fronts. "They've received notices," she wrote. "Mortgage company has called the loan. Trustees are executing the contingency protocol." The words should have felt triumphant and instead were clinical. There was no delight in seeing ruin enacted, only a brittle satisfaction that the architecture had worked as instructed. I remembered Arthur's quiet hands folding paper, his habit of leaving things in the order he meant them to be used. He had prepared for the moment someone would choose expediency over care. The final sound that night was the one I had imagined often in the kettle's hiss, the soft thump of paper being set on a table, and the long, slow sound of someone's face changing. I watched from a distance as David opened one notice and then another. The color bled from his face in a way that seemed to happen to the whole room. Light, swallowed by a shadow. He stood, the paper trembling between his fingers, and I saw the wide, stupid look of a man who had not comprehended how close the edge had been. His shoulders went slack as if a weight had been removed from somewhere I could not see, and then they collapsed as if the air had been pulled out of the room. Their calls started as a tremor and became a roar. At first it was David's number lighting up on my phone, short, sharp rings that I let go to voicemail, thinking perhaps it was another frantic attempt to explain, to negotiate. Then Jennifer called, her voice paper thin, the practiced edge gone. When they finally came to the house, it wasn't with the polish of control, but with ragged shoes and faster breaths. They wanted me to sign things, to reassure them, to be the small, compliant shape that would make their paperwork prettier. "Please, Mum, we can fix this," David said, voice raw, no business cadence left. The plea was a bandage on a wound that had been long forming. Jennifer paced and spoke in quick sentences like someone trying to knit air into something useful. "We can refinance, we can—" She kept glancing at the doorway as if expecting help to step through it. Their calls at first were threats wrapped in concern, lawyer warnings, hints of hearings if I didn't cooperate. Then, when numbers on bank statements landed like stones, The threats dissolved into pleading. They used every language they hoped I would understand: bargaining, shame, entitlement. "You don't understand the stress we're under?" Jennifer muttered once, a phrase meant to turn the table. David's voice cracked. "You've put us in an impossible position." They tried to bargain with my dignity as if it were currency. The same hands that had once taken my groceries now hovered with begging, fingers quivering. I listened to them and watched the color drain from their faces in a way that made the air feel thin and brittle. In that moment, I felt a tide in me finally shift. The dizzying shock that had held me like a hand at my throat loosened. Instead of tensing toward pleading, I drew myself to the small, hard center of decision that had been forming for weeks. Thoughts that had been whispers became commands. I would not become the person who begged at their gate again. I will not return to that driveway. Those words were a hinge. Saying them anchored me more firmly than any clasp of fear. The line between the woman who had once hoped for reconciliation and the woman who would choose herself snapped into place. Their panic made them clumsy. David scrambled through drawers, finding paperwork that had once been intimate, policies, unopened letters, mortgage terms, and waved them as if they were shields. Jennifer made a show of calling every contact she had, rapid-fire pleas into the phone. When their threats faltered, the thinness of their certainty frayed into a new, pleading tone. "Help us, Mum," David said once, and the words fell into the room like a dropped plate. They expected me to fold like tissue and repair their mistakes. I surprised even myself when I did not. The justice I had rehearsed with Victoria was not an act of vengeance for sport, it was a structural redress. I began, calmly and almost mechanically, to exercise Arthur's plan. The lawyers and trustees we'd chosen moved like clockwork. There is an odd comfort in paperwork that behaves, signatures that click into place, trustees who confirm hold orders, bank officers who speak in the precise tones of confidentiality. The foreclosed home that had been their dream, so carefully staged, so painfully curated, fell into the category of assets I could acquire and repurpose. I bought it not to gloat, but to convert. Renovation has its own vocabulary of sound, the dull knock of a sledge against plaster, the scratch of sandpaper bringing a surface to life, the sharp snap of a utility knife. Dust became a new kind of blessing, coating my cardigan in a color that smelled of timber and new paint. We opened up walls and discovered small, private things: a child's scrawled drawing behind a panel, a receipt from a fishing trip, a hidden postcard faded by sun. The house sighed and rearranged itself into rooms that belonged to more than one curated Instagram moment. Hammer blows made a rhythm in my chest that was steadier than any fear. I named the restaurant Margaret's Kitchen because names are promises. The first day the stove fired up the air filled with an honest aroma. Onions melting into oil, bay leaves relieving their perfume, broth simmering down into a clear, warm thing that felt like comfort given back to the world. The scent of soup is a language of its own. Salt, slow-veined marrow, rosemary that curls into steam. Volunteers brought aprons and folding chairs. A retired carpenter who'd watched me in the market offered to hang shelving. Laughter began there like a soft contagion. A table filled with women and men who had been shuffled aside by other families found new reasons to talk. Plates clinked with a sound that was the opposite of the clink of coins on my kitchen table. It was living, convivial noise. The clinic expansion was quieter at first, the smell of antiseptic and a new stack of patient forms, fluorescent lights that did not hum but hummed like a machine ready, then the slow, human honing of services. An intake nurse who knew how to remember names. A social worker who could place warmth into forms. The place filled with the sort of small victories that do not make headlines. A canceled appointment, rescheduled as a surgery, a pensioner who could now afford a hearing aid. Watching the clinic open felt like reading the best of Arthur's life aloud and deciding to add a chapter. Each new patient was a stitch in the community's skin. The day David came to see what had been done, his face held a raw disbelief, a kind of bereavement for plans that had once seemed immovable. He had rehearsed lines that hoped to twist me into guilt, to make me yield. Instead, the sight of his own house, painted now in colors chosen by a community, the garden replanted with herbs for the kitchen, cut him. He stood at the gate and looked small, a man whose scaffolding had been quietly dismantled by a blueprint he had never seen coming. His hand opened and closed with nothing in it. His jaw worked like someone who had lost a language. It was not theatrical. It was slow and private. Jennifer's voice slipped away into ordinary sounds. Chalk against a blackboard, footsteps that felt embarrassed. A social worker who had once favored the language of policies now stood ironing plates in an apron, her sleeves rolled up. The same woman who had once dismissed me now folding napkins for an elderly man who could not afford regular meals. Her hands trembled only the first time she offered a tray. Then they steadied, practiced in a competence that was genuine rather than clinical. I remember the moment in almost cinematic freeze frame. David handed me keys, a small metallic thing whose weight had once been a symbol of ownership. His face wore the look of a man who suddenly realized his childlike grip on property was an illusion. The keys slipped from his fingers as if made of glass. They hit the wooden table and bounced, clattering like a small, surprised animal. A phone slid from his hand and hit the floor, plastic on tile, a thin, graceless sound. The room seemed to hold its breath and then let out a sound that was almost laughter at the absurdness of a life rearranged. I did not gloat. I walked through the converted rooms as if touching an old photograph, fingers trailing along new cupboards, feeling the grain of wood that might once have been a floor in another life. People came. Neighbors, volunteers, the ones who had watched me on the porch that night. They filled the front yard with donated chairs and moved in casseroles and laughter. The first service at Margaret's kitchen felt like a small revolution, a table of men who had not eaten with company in months, 2 women who had been told care homes were their only option, a child whose mother had been working and had nowhere to leave him. The sound of a spoon against a bowl was my kind of anthem. The social worker who had once leaned toward policy now hugged an older man whose hands shook as she led him to a seat. "We should have done this sooner," she said to me once, almost stumbling on the admission. Her face held a kind of private shame that was humbling to witness. It made me think of the ways institutions and humans can learn, if given the chance. David watched some of this from the doorway, his expression an unreadable ledger of regret. He tried to step forward once, to say something that might be more than apology, but the words fell into the air and seemed inadequate to the scale of what had been lost. There is a peculiar peace in choosing to build where there had been neglect. The work of building required decisions that were not pettiness dressed as justice, what to spend on a ramp, what to hire for therapy, whether to open a free meal program once a week. Each small allocation felt like plating a lesson, that resources could restore dignity when administered with care rather than weaponized. We bought beds for those who had been shuffled into institutions for the convenience of others, and put books into a small library where hands could learn again to turn pages. The reflective moments came softly, alone at dusk, standing on the porch of the repurposed home with a cup of tea warming my palms. I let myself think about what had been done. Arthur had been a man who believed in contingency. Perhaps he had known human nature in a way I had not wanted to accept. He had built a mechanism that required cruelty for its engine, and yet had designed the outputs toward compassion. There is a moral complexity in that, a stubborn lesson about the limits of secrecy and the ethics of planning ahead. Love, I realized, can be architectural. It can be drawn in clauses and trustees and contingency plans. It can be practical, not only poetic. Dignity returned not as a thunderclap, but as small reinstatements. A woman who once avoided mirrors now let her reflection stay. A man who had hidden unpaid bills in drawers now spoke by name with the intake nurse about scheduling a specialist. The community we had built provided a different kind of wealth, the right to be seen, to have needs met with courtesy, to be fed not only food but attention. Watching a table full of elders talk and argue about village gossip felt like watching a tiny country reconstitute itself. I visited David once more, not to gloat, but to close a door. He sat at his kitchen table with papers in front of him and an expression that was at once exhausted and oddly freed. We exchanged words that were careful, then more honest. I told him that I forgave what I could, but that forgiveness did not mean erasing what had been done. He listened, and when he tried to explain, his voice shook. There was no cinematic reconciliation, no returned embraces. It was instead a measured conversation between two people who had been reallocated roles in the architecture of their lives. Finally, the day I locked the front door of the house I had once left in a wheelchair felt like the closing of a long, complicated sentence. I turned the key gently, feeling the mechanism click, and for a moment, the sound was like punctuation. Then I walked a short distance, just across the street to the community center, and inserted my key into a new lock. The door swung open with a small, hospitable sound, hinges greeting a new day. Inside, the smell of soup was already warming the air and folding itself into conversations. I turned the key and stood back, letting the building breathe in its new purpose. Justice in my life did not come as thunder. It arrived as a set of precise instruments applied with care, trustees who did not trumpet their role, a kitchen that fed people without asking what they had been, a clinic that opened doors instead of closing them. It was dignity administered structurally rather than theatrically. I had been powerless in a driveway once. Now, I unlocked a place where others could find a seat and be noticed. The act of closing one door and opening another felt like the quietest, proudest revenge there is. To convert betrayal into service and to let the life you thought taken become the life you give. I went from asking for a hand to holding the hand of a plan my husband had quietly made, not for spectacle, but for safety. I am no longer the woman who waited on a driveway. I am the steward of Arthur's careful work, using what he left to restore dignity where it was stripped away. There is no relish in ruin, only a steady satisfaction in turning betrayal into service and in finding purpose in the quiet duty he built for me. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. I delete David's pleading messages with a steady thumb, then carry a steaming bowl down the hall and feed soup to an elderly woman who smiles. The new family I chose. I